Rain found every seam in Nancy Johansson's mantle before the church bells struck 5, and by the time Mrs. Blackthorn's carriage turned into Covent Garden, she was wet to the knees, one hand locked around a trunk strap that bit so deeply into her palm that her fingers had begun to numb. She was 22. She walked behind the carriage instead of inside it, because Mrs. Blackthorn called that arrangement economy, and because economy in that house meant that strangers must see what had become of her. Flower sellers were arranging damp bundles of narcissus beneath striped awnings. Porters shouted over carts loaded with early cabbages and apples still smelling of cold earth. 2 gentlemen in polished boots paused beside a coffee stall and looked from the lacquered carriage to the dark-haired young woman stumbling through shallow gutter water behind it, their expressions settling into the same quick arithmetic everyone performed: relation, not servant; reduced, not dismissed; respectable once, now useful. Nancy kept her eyes on the back axle and walked. The leather strap burned against a split in her skin each time the trunk shifted. Her shoes took in water at the seams. Her heels had cracked in 2 places last week while carrying coal to the attic, and each step now reopened one of the splits with a small, bright pain that climbed her calves and lodged behind her knees. She had eaten a crust before dawn, nothing more. Her stomach had passed hunger and entered its quieter stage, a hollow ache that made her hands tremble when she held anything too long. At the Market Square's centre, Mrs. Blackthorn tapped the carriage roof once with a gloved finger, and the coachman pulled up without turning his head. The widow descended in dark plum silk with rose water rising from her cuffs in a soft cloud that did not belong to morning rain. Her 2 daughters followed in velvet half boots, laughing under one umbrella. Nancy stopped 3 paces behind them and lowered the trunk as gently as she could, though her wrist shook from the effort. "Do not stand as if you belong with us," Mrs. Blackthorn said, not loudly, yet every syllable carried. "Take the parcel list. Keep close. If one ribbon is wrong, you will answer for it." Nancy accepted the folded paper. The ink had blurred at the edges from damp air. She could still read every line. 12 yards of cream satin, imported lace, candied peel, 2 cases of French soap, coal oil, hyacinth bulbs, no item for the attic room where she slept under a roof tile that leaked each time wind pushed rain from the west. She followed as they moved stall to stall. She lifted boxes. She held bundles against her chest while merchants bowed to Mrs. Blackthorn and pretended not to see the girl at her shoulder shivering in a mended sleeve. By 7, her arms were striped red from twine pressure. By 8, rain had turned to a fine needling mist that settled under her collar and stayed there, cold as metal. She listened while Mrs. Blackthorn praised thrift to one vendor and spent enough on imported perfume to feed the kitchen for a month. She listened while one stepsister asked whether Nancy might be made to sleep in the pantry for the winter to save candle wax, and the other answered that attic girls should be grateful for rafters at all. The parcel slipped when the fishmonger's boy barreled past with a crate of ice. Nancy caught the first bundle against her hip, but the second spun from her forearm, struck the stones, and split at one corner. White sugar spilled into rainwater in a bright, dissolving mound. For one brief moment there was no sound except the hiss of drizzle on canvas and the thin rattle of carriage wheels in the lane beyond. Then Mrs. Blackthorn crossed the space between them and struck Nancy across the face with a flat palm. The impact turned her head, not hard enough to throw her down, hard enough to mark ownership before an audience. Gasps rose and died. A butcher looked away. A maid at the herb stand stared openly, jaw tight, then dropped her eyes when Mrs. Blackthorn's gaze moved toward her. Nancy tasted salt and metal where her teeth had caught the inside of her lip. She did not raise a hand to her cheek. She did not speak. Stillness had become a discipline years ago, and she used it now the way another woman might use a shield. "Clumsy creature," Mrs. Blackthorne said. "You will pay for this waste from your allowance." Nancy had no allowance. Everyone within earshot knew it. The statement was not an accounting error. It was theatre. Nancy knelt in wet grit, gathered the salvageable sugar into the torn paper with fingers that no longer felt fully like her own, and stood when told. Water dripped from her dark hair onto her collarbone. Her eyes, large and very clear in a face everyone called plain, gave nothing back to the crowd. That, too, had been learned. People were kinder to tears than to silence, but tears gave them memory. Silence let her choose what remained. Her father had once crossed this same square in a closed carriage with ledgers balanced on his knee, and called her his best reader when she was 12, and stubborn enough to correct a clerk twice his age. He had believed a temporary loan could carry one bad season. He had believed signatures could be repaired later if harvest improved. He had died with fever before the later arrived, and winter had taken her mother 1 year after, in a room where the fire had burned down, because no one had thought to send more coal. Mrs. Blackthorne entered the house as bride, then widow, then keeper of every key. Nancy's bedchamber was given to silk, mirrors, and the elder daughter's pianoforte. The estate library was locked. Nancy was moved to the attic under bare beams, where wind whistled through cracked putty and frost painted the inside of the glass on January mornings. Bread grew stale in the kitchen cupboard before it reached her plate. Work multiplied with each passing month. Linen mended by candle end. Silver polished until her knuckles split. Floors scrubbed with ash soap. Accounts spoken over her as if she were furniture. Yet the figures never left her. She held numbers in her head while carrying coal scuttles up narrow stairs. She remembered which tenant had paid in full and which debt had doubled without reason. At night, when the house settled and the last footman banked the kitchen fire, she lifted the loose board beneath her truckle bed and entered each transaction into a hidden ledger wrapped in old muslin. Ink, date, sum, initial. She had her father's hand for columns. She had his patience for fraud. She had no legal name for what she was building, only the certainty that records outlived cruelty if kept dry and exact. When the buying ended, the carriage took Mrs. Blackthorne and her daughters toward Blackthorne House, with curtains drawn against the damp. Nancy was told to walk the remainder with the trunk and 3 parcels balanced against her ribs, the torn one repacked and tied with kitchen string that cut into softened skin. The streets had filled. Clerks hurried with satchels beneath their coats. Apprentices shouted outside print shops. A nurse in a clean cap steered 2 children around a puddle and around Nancy in the same motion, as if avoiding contamination. At the crossing near street, Paul's, she stopped when the strap slipped again and pressed her hand against a wall to steady herself. Her palm left a faint red print on wet stone where the leather had broken skin. She looked at it once, then wiped it away with her sleeve. By the time she reached the mews gate behind the house, her lips were pale and she could not feel 2 fingers on her right hand. No one met her. No one counted the weight she had carried. In the back corridor, Cook took one glance at her face and slid half a heel of bread across the table without speaking. Nancy nodded thanks and kept moving because delay could cost more than hunger. She carried parcels upstairs, received 3 new instructions before she had removed her wet mantle, and worked through the grey afternoon with the sting in her cheek, fading to heat, then to nothing. This was the practice she had given herself. Forget quickly enough to survive. Forget the hand. Remember the figures. Forget the laughter. Remember the seal on the invoice from Harrow and Pike. By the time night pressed against the attic panes, she had wrung out her hem, hidden the day's entries beneath the floorboard, and taught her pulse to quiet at last, though rain still tapped the roof above her bed like fingers counting debt. Rain still tapped the roof above her bed like fingers counting debt, and Nancy lay on her narrow mattress, fully dressed, one hand under the thin blanket to warm the swollen knuckles that had stiffened around the trunk strap all morning. The attic smelled of wet wool, old plaster, and the faint coal smoke that climbed through cracked brick from the kitchen flue. Water gathered at the corner where the slate tile had shifted last winter, then dropped at measured intervals into the chipped basin she kept beneath it, a patient metronome for sleepless hours. She turned her face toward the wall and listened for the household to settle. A door closed on the second floor. Laughter drifted up the stairwell, bright and careless, then vanished beneath the rustle of silk and the thud of a fire grate being drawn. Those sounds belonged to the rooms that had once held her own books and her mother's pianoforte and the walnut writing desk her father had bought at auction because she had stood on tiptoe to trace the inlay and called it beautiful. None of those objects had vanished. They had only moved one landing lower, as if she had been the piece of furniture not worth preserving. She waited until the corridor outside her door stopped creaking, then reached beneath the bed slats and lifted the loose floorboard with the tip of a hairpin. The muslin-wrapped ledger came up, cool and dry, its corners worn smooth by handling. She set it on her knees, trimmed the candle wick with sewing scissors, and reopened the day in ink. Sugar lost in rain, deducted though never paid. Carriage hire entered under household necessity. Perfume listed as medicinal oils. 2 ribbons charged to kitchen accounts. She wrote each line twice, once as claimed, once as true. Her father had taught her that arithmetic was not only sum and subtraction, but character made visible. A straight column told one story. A bent column told another. He had said it in the library while November rain ran down leaded panes, and she sat opposite him with her feet not yet touching the floor, repeating figures until she could hold 10 pages in memory without looking down. His hand had been warm then, his voice unhurried, his cuff ink-stained because he corrected his own entries before any clerk dared touch them. Fever had hollowed him in less than a fortnight. By the 4th night he could no longer hold a pen. By the 6th he had mistaken her for her mother and apologised to Eyre. Men from Harrow and Pike came before he was buried, hats in hand, soft voices, papers already folded for signature. Temporary relief, they called it. Seasonal strain. A respectable bridge loan secured against future rents. Nancy had stood in the passage while Mrs. Blackthorne received them with lowered lashes and spoke of practical burdens no young lady could understand. After the funeral, the practical burdens multiplied with mathematical precision. Locks changed, keys reassigned, pantry stores measured as if famine had begun, coal counted by scuttle, candles issued by half-length. The new mistress called restraint a virtue and hunger an exaggeration. She called Nancy's father careless in front of guests and called Nancy sentimental when she objected. By Lent of the next year, the east pasture had been leased below value to a cousin of Mrs. Blackthorne's brother. By midsummer, 3 tenants with paid receipts were listed as delinquent and threatened with removal unless they produced coin a second time. Nancy had copied every discrepancy into this book while kneeling beside her truckle bed, breath clouding in winter air, fingers cramped to a claw around the pen because ink froze if the bottle sat open too long. She had learned to blot quickly, to dry pages over a candle without scorching them, to muffle each turn with her sleeve so footsteps in the corridor would not hear paper move. She had learned also to let one memory go in order to keep another exact. The slap in the market would fade by dawn because she required her strength for columns. Her father's voice would not fade because she refused permission. The knock came as 2 hard taps, then a pause, then one more. Martha's pattern when instructions came from below, and no refusal would be tolerated. Nancy closed the ledger, wrapped it, lowered it beneath the board, and opened the door before the maid could knock again. Martha's apron was damp at the hem. A strand of grey hair had worked loose from her cap and clung to her cheek. "Drawing room," she murmured, eyes flicking once to Nancy's split lip and away. "Now, she has company." Nancy nodded, took her mended shawl from the bedpost, and followed the cold draught down 2 flights of stairs, past the gallery where ancestral portraits had been rehung to favour Mrs. Blackthorn's side of the room, past the corridor table where her mother's porcelain spaniels had stood until one sister called them vulgar and sent them to a charity sale. Candlelight thickened as she approached the drawing-room. Heat met her first, then lavender and rosewater, then the scrape of chair legs over carpet as conversation paused to mark her entrance. Miss Blackthorn sat nearest the fire in black satin with jet beading at her throat, widow's restraint translated into expensive texture. On the settee to her left lounged her daughters, Adelaide and Frances, both in pale silk wrappers, though it was not yet fully evening, each wearing something that had belonged to Nancy by right before. Right had been renamed Indulgence. Adelaide had pinned Nancy's mother's seed-pearl comb above one temple, not because it suited her, but because she knew exactly whose hand had once polished each pearl with soft linen. Frances had draped herself in the blue cashmere shawl Nancy had mended at 14, the one her father brought from a London broker and placed around his daughter's shoulders with an awkward solemnity that made her laugh. A gentleman from Harrow and Pike occupied the chair opposite the hearth, ledger open on his knee, spectacles low on his nose. He did not rise when Nancy entered. He didn't need to. Men like him rose for rank, not for evidence. "There she is," Mrs. Blackthorn said. "Our household cipher. Come forward. Read line 17. Nancy took the offered book. The column had been prepared for performance. Coal allotment, inflated by 1/3. Linen replacement, doubled. Apothecary charges assigned to the old gardener who had not worked there in 6 months since his leg failed. She read exactly what was written, because contradiction before witnesses would be called insolence and used later to justify punishment out of sight. "Louder," Adelaide said without looking up from her embroidery hoop. "One can barely hear Attic diction from across the room." Frances laughed into her tea. The sound was light, the intention was not. Nancy read again. The Harrow and Pike gentleman made a note. Mrs. Blackthorn watched Nancy's face the way one watched weather through a window, not because she cared, but because she preferred to predict when resistance might break. "You see," she said to the gentleman, "how much strain this house bears. My late husband's daughter mistakes arithmetic for grievance. She has a dramatic turn, useful in stories, less so in management." The words landed cleanly because they were practiced. Nancy held the ledger open with both hands and kept her breathing even. Her fingers ached from morning rain and from the urge to close the book on Mrs. Blackthorn's polished nails. She did neither. She turned the page when asked. She recited the figures. She watched the gentleman nod over false totals and knew each one had a twin entry in the boards beneath her bed. When the reading ended, Mrs. Blackthorn extended her cup without looking. Nancy moved to take it and saw, on the side table beside the sugar tongs, a small key on a braided ribbon. Library brass. Her father's initials scratched at the bow where his thumb used to worry the metal smooth while he thought. For a moment heat rushed up her throat so sharply she tasted iron again. Mrs. Blackthorne followed her gaze and smiled, thin as thread. "You remember that room still," she said softly. "How touching. Frances has taken to reading there in the afternoon. It calms her nerves. Put more coal in tomorrow. Her hands chill easily." Frances lifted one pale wrist and sighed agreement as if illness had been diagnosed. Nancy set down the empty cup. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Her voice did not shake. She curtsied. She withdrew 3 steps before turning because manners, like silence, could be sharpened into refusal without ever appearing as such. She was halfway up the service stair when Adelaide called from the landing above. "Nancy, my white muslin needs new lace before morning. You will unpick the old border and reset the hem." "I have promised to wear it," Frances added, leaning over the banister with the blue shawl trailing like a banner taken in war. "And brush my velvet shoes. The black pair, not the green. You know which." Their requests came not as necessity but as sport, timed for the hour when her hands were stiff and her eyes grainy with fatigue. Nancy turned back, inclined her head, and accepted both tasks because refusal would cost Martha more work and invite complaint that always travelled downward before it reached its target. In the sewing room she lit 2 candles instead of 1, and paid for the extravagance by trimming tomorrow's wick stash shorter. Muslin pooled over her lap like cold water. Tiny stitches bit into the pad of her thumb until a bead of red surfaced, bright as sealing wax, and she pressed it away with linen before it could stain the dress. Through the thin wall she could hear the sisters in the next chamber sorting ribbon boxes that had once lined her own wardrobe shelves. They spoke of invitations and officers and whether the vicar's niece had altered her nose with too much powder. Then, as if discussing weather, Adelaide said, "She looked quite feral this morning in the market, did she not? Wet hair, that stare. One might have mistaken her for a dock girl." Frances answered, "Dock girls have better colour. She has none. It is useful. Mother says plain girls invite less trouble." A pause. Tissue paper crackled. "Still," Adelaide said, lower now, "Father did call her pretty when she was small." Frances gave a short laugh. "Father called every weak thing precious. Puppies, old books, broken clocks." Nancy's needle moved through muslin, out, back, in. The rhythm steadied her pulse. She thought of the walnut desk in the library, of her father's watch chain glinting when he bent over columns, of his patience when she blotted ink and ruined a page and expected rebuke. She thought of her mother's fingers on the piano keys before winter cough took breath from her chest in ragged handfuls and left silence where Schubert had lived. She thought of how quickly rooms changed, owners' once signatures changed hands. By the 2nd week of November, after her father's burial, Mrs. Blackthorne had ordered Nancy's gowns altered for practical use and cut 2 ball dresses into curtains for the morning room. By Christmas, Nancy's name had disappeared from gift accounts entirely, though parcels arrived weekly for both sisters tied with imported cord. By spring, her place at table had moved from family service to sideboard standing, then to kitchen bench after guests remarked on the awkwardness of mixed company. Demotion did not happen in a single stroke. It happened by inches, each one deniable. Each one entered nowhere except the body that endured it. Her shoulders had learned to fold inward when doorways narrowed. Her stomach had learned the hours when food might appear if she did not ask. Her mind had learned the opposite lesson. Ask the page, ask the number, ask the date, because figures did not blush and look away when struck. Near midnight she finished Adelaide's hem, brushed both pairs of Frances's shoes because she no longer trusted instructions given in mockery, banked the sewing room fire, and climbed back to the attic with the candles guttering low. Her fingers were cramped into hooks. Her cheek had cooled where the morning blow had landed. She knelt by the bed, lifted the board, and added 4 new lines to the hidden ledger. Muslin lace billed to household repairs. Library coal reassigned to medical comforts. Shoes purchased in duplicate. 1 entry erased in the formal book. Shawl from Johansen Trousseau, now listed as Blackthorn personal property. She sanded the wet ink. She blew out the light. In darkness, the roof kept counting, patient and exact, while Nancy lay awake beside her evidence and let the day become weight instead of wound. A fist struck her door hard enough to shake plaster dust from the beam above her bed, and Nancy was upright before the second blow landed, blanket twisted at her knees, heart hammering against her ribs as if she had been running. "Down!" Mrs. Blackthorn called from the corridor, her voice sharpened by impatience and perfume. "Now, bring the grey muslin. You are required." Nancy dragged chilled fingers through her hair, pinned it with the first comb she could find, and changed behind the screen into the mended gown Adelaide had rejected last season for being too plain at the throat. The bodice had been altered twice and sat wrong across her shoulders. The hem had a water stain she could not hide. She had no gloves, without split seams. By the time she reached the back stair, Mrs. Blackthorn was already cloaked for evening. Daughters in pale silk and seed pearls, all 3 framed in candlelight like a portrait of prosperity that needed one darker stroke to flatter the rest. "You will walk behind us and remain silent unless addressed," Mrs. Blackthorn said as they crossed the hall. "If asked, you are a poor relation who has forgotten how to be grateful." The carriage lurched forward through wet streets, smelling of coal smoke and river mud, and Nancy took the narrow rear perch beside a footman whose expression stayed carefully blank while rain needled sideways beneath the hood and soaked the grey muslin to her knees. Lamps from shop fronts slid across puddles. Music drifted from open tavern doors in ragged bursts. London did not sleep so much as lower its voice. At the Vauxhall entrance, lanterns burned along the gravel walk in trembling rows, their light catching on wet leaves, on gilt railings, on satin skirts lifted clear of mud by gloved fingers that had never scrubbed their own floors. Mrs. Blackthorn took one look at Nancy's damp hem and moved her with 2 words and a tilt of her chin. "There, shadows!" Nancy obeyed and stood near an iron rail beneath a chestnut tree, where the music reached her delayed, softened by drizzle and distance. She watched ladies drift beneath coloured lamps. She watched gentlemen bow, laugh, and bargain with compliments that carried farther than they intended. A supper tray passed her, and did not pause. Hunger twisted, then settled into its old, disciplined ache. She folded her hands to hide their tremor. Her cheek, struck that morning, had begun to throb again in the damp cold. She could see Mrs. Blackthorn at the centre promenade, receiving smiles as if admiration were rent due monthly and always paid in full. She could see Adelaide leaning close to an officer with silver braid, Frances spinning her fan in little circles to draw eyes, and then dismiss them. Nancy was meant to be near enough to summon, far enough to deny. She had almost convinced her body to stillness when a scream split the music, high and abrupt, followed by the metallic crash of a wheel striking iron and the blunt sound of weight hitting gravel. People recoiled in a rippling line. Silk swept backward. Men stepped clear to save polished boots. A lantern dropped and rolled, throwing wild light over faces gone pale with fascination. A phaeton horse, half-harnessed and wild-eyed, jerked sideways against its traces, while a groom fought for the bit, and cursed through clenched teeth. Near the rail, a boy in dark wool had been knocked down by the broken shaft and lay gasping, one arm pinned awkwardly beneath him, rain striking his face in quick silver beads. Someone shouted for a surgeon. Someone else said not to touch him. No one touched him. Nancy moved before permission could be demanded. Gravel bit through her skirt as she knelt. The boy's breath rattled in short catches. His collar had twisted tight against his throat. She slid 2 fingers beneath the linen, loosened it, turned his head to clear his airway, and spoke low, steady words she did not know she remembered until they came. Slowly. Breathe where I tell you. Look at me. Stay with me. His eyes found hers and skittered away in panic. She braced his shoulder without forcing him flat, felt the tremor running through his chest and judged by instinct where not to press. Rain ran down her neck. Mud soaked through to her skin. Behind her, a familiar rustle of silk advanced and stopped. "Nancy!" Mrs. Blackthorn's voice, thin with controlled fury. "Leave that boy! You are making a spectacle." Nancy did not look up. "He cannot breathe properly." "You are not a physician." "No, Mum." She tightened the improvised support at his shoulder with the torn strip of her own undersleeve. "But he will worsen if moved badly." Gasps pricked the air around them, not for the fallen boy now, but for the disobedience quiet and unmistakable. Mrs. Blackthorn stepped closer, shoes sinking into wet grit she would later blame on servants. "Stand up this instant!" The command struck and hung. Nancy felt the old reflex, the drilled obedience that had saved her from 100 smaller punishments, rise and strain against the harder thing underneath it. She kept one hand at the boy's neck, counting each breath. "I will stand when someone steadies him in my place," she said, voice low enough to be heard only by those nearest. A young footman, scarcely older than Nancy, flinched forward and then halted when Mrs. Blackthorn turned her head. Fear pinned him where rank had pinned everyone else. The fallen boy coughed once, choked, then drew a fuller breath. Nancy shifted her palm under his shoulder and called, without lifting her gaze, "If any gentleman here has medical training, come now." For one suspended second only rain answered. Then boots struck gravel with purposeful weight from the dark end of the path, and the circle of spectators opened without being asked, parting around a tall man in a black greatcoat, with water shining on the broad line of his shoulders and a white scar cutting pale across one knuckle, where he had stripped off a glove in haste. By the time he reached her, Nancy's skirts were drenched and her hands were streaked with mud and lamp soot, one sleeve ripped to the elbow, hair loosening from its pins against her throat. Yet she did not rise. The stranger crouched opposite her with military precision, assessed the fallen boy in one sweep, then shifted his gaze to her face and held it there one beat too long, as if placing her. His eyes were a storm grey that revealed nothing and missed nothing. "Who has touched him?" he asked. His voice carried command without volume. 3 men answered at once to say they had not. Nancy said, "I loosened his collar. I stabilized his shoulder. He was choking." The stranger nodded once. "Good. Keep his head as it is." He turned. "You, blue waistcoat, fetch the surgeon from the lower pavilion. Run. You, hold that horse before it kills someone." The selected men moved immediately, relief visible in the speed of their obedience. Power recognized itself and complied. Mrs. Blackthorn, left on the edge of the circle with rain darkening her silk, recovered her smile for an approaching pair of acquaintances and said with brittle sweetness, "My companion overreaches. She is eager to appear useful." The stranger did not look at her. "Madam," he said, each syllable flat as steel, "step back or you will interfere." Colour rose beneath Mrs. Blackthorn's powder. She stepped back. Nancy felt the boy's pulse flutter against her fingers, irregular but present. The stranger reached inside his coat, drew out a clean linen square, and placed it in her free hand without ceremony. "For the rain in his eyes." She used it, shielding the boy's face while keeping his airway clear. Close, like this, she could see dark stubble at the stranger's jaw. Rain caught at his lashes. A tear in his cuff, where a smear of blood had dried to rusty brown. Not his blood, perhaps. Or old. It did not matter. He shifted, braced one knee in gravel, and spoke low enough for her alone. "When I tell you, we turn him together. Not before." Nancy met his stare. "If his breathing worsens, we do it sooner." A pause. His mouth tightened, not quite displeasure, not quite assent. "You are giving orders to a stranger in a public garden." "I am trying to keep a boy alive." That drew a flicker across his face, gone before it could become expression. "On my count," he said. 1, 2, now." They moved in one controlled motion, enough to free the trapped arm without twisting the spine. The boy cried out, then gulped air in a fuller rhythm. Footsteps pounded back across gravel. A surgeon in a dark cloak dropped to his knees, examined quickly, and pronounced that the boy had likely dislocated his shoulder and bruised his ribs, but would live if carried properly, and seen within the hour. Relief loosened the crowd into chatter. Curiosity replaced concern. Already the story was changing shape in their mouths. Nancy sat back on her heels, rainwater running from her sleeves, and only then felt how violently her hands were shaking. She tucked them into her lap. The tall stranger rose, offered her his hand out of reflex rather than gallantry, then seemed to reconsider and let it fall before she could take it. He looked down at her ripped sleeve, at the bruised mark visible where her cuff had slipped, at the threadbare edge of a gown repeatedly mended and repeatedly mocked. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nancy Johansson." She stood without assistance. Mud clung to the hem in heavy crescents. "Companion to Mrs. Blackthorne this evening." "Companion," he repeated, and the single word made plain what he thought of that fiction. From behind him came a breathless voice, male, deferential. "Your Grace, the carriage is ready. Mr. Hale has been informed." The title moved through the remaining onlookers like a cold draught. Backs straightened, heads bowed. Nancy saw the shift and understood the scale of the man before her. In an instant she could not afford to misread. Duke, rank beyond argument. A person whose displeasure could close doors from London to the northern fells without ever sounding like a threat. He turned back to her. "Alistair Vale," he said. "Marrowind." Rain struck the iron rail between them in a rapid, metallic rhythm. Mrs. Blackthorne was watching now with sharpened attention, calculation overtaking embarrassment. Nancy gave the formal curtsy due his station despite mud and numb fingers. "Your Grace." His gaze returned to her face, searching, assessing, then hardening into the practised indifference of men accustomed to deciding the worth of others, quickly and aloud. "You should clean yourself," he said. "You are forgettable." The words landed cleanly, almost clinically, as if he had named weather. Around them, conversation resumed in low, avid streams. Mrs. Blackthorne exhaled through her nose, satisfaction briefly visible before she masked it. Nancy felt the old burn of humiliation rise, steady and cool. Forget quickly enough to survive. She had trained for this for years. She lowered her eyes because protocol required it, not because the sentence had struck where he intended. "As you wish, Your Grace." He watched her 1 second longer, as though waiting for flinch or plea or gratitude and finding none. Then he turned on his heel and strode toward the waiting carriage, greatcoat snapping once in the wind, attendants falling in behind him with the automatic precision of men orbiting power. Mrs. Blackthorne reached Nancy first, fingers biting her elbow through wet muslin. "You will not speak of this," she hissed, smile fixed for passing guests. "Not one word in my house." Nancy looked past her to where the surgeon's men lifted the injured boy onto a stretcher, careful now, exactly as she had asked. "No, ma'am," she said. An hour later, as Vauxhall lamps guttered in the rain and the Blackthorn carriage rattled back through dark lanes, Nancy sat on the rear perch with water freezing in the folds of her skirt and repeated one fact silently until it settled into place. She remembered the boy who fell, the angle of his breath, the count between each pulse. She did not need to remember the Duke at all. An hour later, the carriage turned into Blackthorn House, wheels grinding over wet stone, and Nancy climbed down from the rear perch with legs so cold they barely answered her. Mrs. Blackthorn did not wait for the footman to lower the step. She descended in a hard sweep of black silk and pulled Nancy into the side passage by the elbow, nails biting through damp muslin. "You will speak of tonight to no one," she said. "Not cook, not Martha, not even in your sleep." Nancy's sleeve dripped onto the flagged floor between them. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Blackthorn's mouth tightened at the obedience, as if she had hoped for resistance she could punish. "And if any caller asks, you were nowhere near the accident. You remained where you were placed." Nancy held her gaze. "That would be false." "Falsehood is sometimes duty. My duty was to the child." The slap did not come this time. Mrs. Blackthorn had learned, as Nancy had, which battles played well before witnesses and which did not. She released Nancy's arm with a small shove and lowered her voice. "Then hear me with care. Mr. Gideon Pike dines tomorrow. You will accept his offer before the pudding is cleared, or you will leave this house with what you can carry in your 2 hands. I will not feed ingratitude any longer." Gideon Pike, Harrow and Pike's elder partner. 50, perhaps more. Breath sweetened with cloves over bad teeth. Fingers always clean. Eyes never warm. Nancy felt her stomach draw inward and stay there. "You require an answer by tomorrow." "I require your signature by tomorrow." Mrs. Blackthorn turned away before Nancy could reply, rose water trailing behind her like a claim staked in air, and swept toward the front stair where her daughters waited, bright with after-evening chatter. Nancy stood in the corridor with rain pooling at her feet, and understood the shape of the trap with painful clarity. A marriage license or the street, a creditor as husband or winter without wages. She took one breath, then another, and carried her soaked skirt up to the attic. By the time she stripped out of the wet muslin, her hands were shaking so hard she could not work the last hook at her back. She slept not at all. She lit the candle, opened the floorboard, and brought up the hidden ledger, adding 3 lines in tight, disciplined script, while wind pushed damp through the warped pane. Coercive marriage demand tied to debt collection. Witness present, none sympathetic. Timeline imposed, less than 1 day. Ink darkened the paper. Facts steadied her pulse. She had just wrapped the book and lowered it into its hiding place when the same 3-knock pattern sounded at her door. Martha stood outside with her apron thrown over her shoulders and a folded letter pinched between 2 fingers, as if it might burn. "From Marrowwind House," she whispered. "Came by rider at dawn. For Mrs. Blackthorn first. She sent it up, unopened." Nancy took the letter. Heavy cream paper, wax seal pressed with a ducal crest, a tower over crossed branches. She broke it carefully and read by the weak grey light. "Miss Nancy Johansen, by direction of His Grace the Duke of Marrowwind, and on the recommendation of Surgeon Bell, I request your immediate attendance at Marrowwind Hall as temporary companion to Master Lewis Hale, injured last evening at Vauxhall, and presently fevered. Terms: 4 guineas weekly, board included, duration until child is judged stable. If you are willing, present yourself with haste. Mrs. Davies, housekeeper, 4 guineas, more than she had seen in one place since her father died. Martha watched her face, eyes narrowing with cautious hope. "Will she let you go?" "She sent it up unopened," Nancy said. "She wishes me gone." Mrs. Blackthorne did more than permit it. She arranged it within the hour, speaking of sacrifice and female duty, while a hired coach was called, and Nancy's one serviceable trunk was dropped at the step, as if it had been packed for this purpose all along. In the front hall, before the footman tied the straps, Mrs. Blackthorne drew close enough for only Nancy to hear. "You will return when dismissed," she murmured, "and if Mr. Pike asks after you, I shall say you accepted with gratitude and required only time for trousseau." Nancy met her eyes. "Do not promise what is not yours to promise." Mrs. Blackthorne smiled without warmth. "Everything under this roof is mine to promise." Nancy did not answer. She climbed into the coach with her trunk, her mended shawl, and the weight of her father's silver watch in her pocket, the one object she had never let Mrs. Blackthorne inventory. As the city thinned into wet fields and hedged lanes, she pressed the watch once in her palm like a prayer, and then put it away. By late afternoon the rain had thinned to mist. Marrowwind Hall rose from the grey-like carved stone pulled from a winter sea, long windows dark, chimneys breathing thin smoke into a low sky. 2 grooms met the coach. A maid in plain black led Nancy through a side entrance into heat, beeswax, and quiet. Not the strained quiet of Blackthorne House, where silence was punishment. This was the quiet of a place holding its breath for one sick child. Mrs. Davies waited in the servants' hall doorway, broad-shouldered, silver hair pinned without ornament, eyes quick and direct. "Miss Johansen," she said, "you are wet through. This way. Speak while we walk." They moved down a corridor lined with portraits gone dim in the failing light. "He is 10, Mrs. Davies said. "Master Lewis Hale, son of his Grace's late captain, dead in the Peninsula. The boy has lived here 2 years. Shoulder reset, bruised ribs. Fever rose at noon. He asks for the lady from the garden and refuses broth from anyone else." "I am not a nurse," Nancy said. "No, you are the person he trusts." They reached a bedchamber warmed to near stifling. A boy lay propped on pillows, lashes wet with sweat, curls plastered to his forehead, right arm strapped against his chest with careful bandaging that still looked too tight for comfort. His breathing came fast and shallow. On the bedside table stood untouched broth, a cloth gone lukewarm, and an empty medicine spoon. Nancy stepped closer. "Master Lewis." His eyes opened halfway. Fear moved through them before recognition settled. "You came," he whispered, voice raw. "I said I would stay while you breathed properly," she answered. "Now you must keep your side of the bargain." His mouth trembled toward a smile and failed. "Hurts." "I know." She set down her bag, washed her hands in the basin, and checked the bindings with careful fingers. The surgeon's work was sound. The fever was not. She reached for the medicine bottle and found none. "Where is his draught?" she asked. Mrs. Davies's jaw set. Apothecary refused to release the second vial. Account unpaid. Mr. Crowell said he would settle it tomorrow. "Who is Mr. Crowell?" "Estate steward." Nancy looked at the child's flushed face, then at the untouched broth, then back to Mrs. Davies. "Tomorrow is too late." Mrs. Davies gave a short, bitter nod that suggested this was not the first tomorrow that had cost someone. "I sent again." No rider returned yet. Nancy stood very still for 1 second, calculating distance, coin, and consequence. Then she reached into her pocket and drew out her father's watch. Silver, heavy, engraved with JJ inside the lid. The hinge clicked when she opened it, the sound as familiar as breath. Is there a pawnbroker in the village? Mrs. Davies stared at the watch, then at Nancy. Yes. Send a groom with me now. I can send him alone. The apothecary may delay him. He will not delay the person paying. Mrs. Davies hesitated only a moment. Take Tom, back gate. Nancy bent and touched 2 fingers to Lewis's wrist. Pulse fast, skin burning. I shall return before dark, she told him. He caught weakly at her sleeve. Do not let them move me. I shall not. The village sat a mile down a rutted lane where rainwater had gathered in long brown mirrors. The pawnbroker's shop smelled of damp wool and metal polish. The man behind the grate took the watch, weighed it, named a figure that insulted both silver and memory, and did not raise his eyes. It is worth double, Nancy said. It is worth what I can sell. She held his stare. It carries initials and keeps perfect time. Wind it. He did, listened and grunted. Slightly better then. She signed the ticket with a hand that did not shake until after the pen left paper. At the apothecary 2 doors down, she paid in full for fever draught and willow bark powder, demanded written receipt, and watched each bottle wrapped and sealed before she left the counter. Night had fallen by the time she returned to Marrowwind. Lamps burned in the corridor. Mrs. Davies met her at the chamber door, took 1 look at the parcel, and exhaled. He worsened in the last hour, she said. Nancy moved past her. Lewis was half delirious, whispering for his father, trying to shift against instructions, and whimpering when pain punished him for it. Nancy measured the draught, cooled his face, coaxed him through each swallow with low, steady words, then sat beside him, counting breaths until the pattern eased from frantic to merely fast. By the 2nd dose, his skin had cooled by 1 small, measurable degree. 2 hours later, when he finally slept, Nancy rose from the bedside with knees that threatened to fold, and found Mrs. Davies waiting in the doorway with a tray. Tea gone tannic, bread, thin slices of cheese. You have not eaten, the housekeeper said. Nancy took the bread because refusal now would be vanity. Thank you. Mrs. Davies watched her for a moment. His Grace returned an hour ago. He asked twice whether the boy was stable. He is with Mr. Crowle and the surgeon. Nancy nodded and looked back at Lewis. The child's breathing had deepened. Relief came sharp and brief, then made room for the next practical fear. Why was the apothecary account unpaid? She asked. Mrs. Davies's expression closed. Ask the steward. I intend to. At 11:30, with the house gone quiet and rain beginning again against the long windows, Nancy stood outside the estate study with a candle in one hand and Mrs. Davies beside her. I cannot authorise this, the housekeeper said softly, but I can unlock the door and fail to notice if a temporary companion reads by night. Nancy gave a tired, crooked incline of her head. That would be a generous failure. The study smelled of leather, ash and old paper. Shelves rose to a gallery that wrapped 3 walls, reached by a narrow iron stair. A fire had burned low to embers. On the desk lay the current rent ledgers, open but untidy, columns corrected in 3 different inks. Nancy set her candle near the inkwell and began. She traced 6 months of tenant entries, cross-checked apothecary disbursements, and found the pattern before midnight. Small amounts skimmed from medical and school accounts, moved to road maintenance, then reappearing as private reimbursements signed by Crowle. Not theft in one dramatic line, theft in quiet increments, hidden in respectable handwriting. At 1 a.m, she found eviction notices drafted for 3 tenant families, marked delinquent despite receipts, noted in margin shorthand. The same shorthand her father had used for paid in hand. The same marks crossed out in fresh ink. Her fatigue vanished under a hard, clear focus she had not felt in months. She pulled fresh paper, copied each discrepancy, and drafted a suspension order in formal language she remembered from her father's dictation days. By the first hour after midnight had passed into the second, she had assembled a packet: duplicate accounts, copied receipts, apothecary refusal, steward reimbursements, and 3 tenant names underlined twice. She sanded the pages and sealed them with plain wax from the desk drawer. Then she wrote 2 notes, one to Mrs. Davies requesting immediate hold on evictions pending direct ducal review, the other to the head groom to ride at dawn with payment to the apothecary for 1 month in advance from discretionary kitchen reserve, to be reimbursed from steward's salary if his grace approved. She sat back, flexed cramped fingers, and only then noticed the quiet had changed. Not in the room, above it. She looked up toward the gallery and saw, half shadowed between 2 shelves, the line of a tall man standing perfectly still, one hand resting on the iron rail. No candle, no movement, dark coat, pale scar across one knuckle where it caught a stray thread of firelight. The Duke of Marrowwind had been there long enough for rainwater to dry on his shoulders. Nancy's pulse jumped once and steadied. She rose from the desk. "Your Grace, I did not hear you enter." He came down the iron stair 1 measured step at a time, gaze on the packet, then on her face, then on the muslin cuff where dried mud from Vauxhall still shadowed the seam despite washing. "What is that?" he asked. "Evidence of arithmetic fraud affecting your tenants, the school account, and Master Lewis's medicine." She pushed the packet across the blotter toward him. "I took the liberty of preparing summaries because the original ledgers are not fit for quick reading." His eyes narrowed fractionally. "You took many liberties." "Yes, Your Grace." A pause stretched between them, not empty, but weighted. He opened the packet, scanned 1 page, then another. His jaw tightened once at the apothecary entry. He set the papers down with precise care. "Who assisted you?" Mrs. Davies unlocked the study. "No one else?" "You sold something today." It was not a question. Nancy felt the absence of the watch like a missing pulse. "Yes. What?" "My father's silver watch." "For the medicine." His gaze held hers, storm grey, unreadable. "Why? Because a child was burning with fever while men deferred payment to tomorrow. Because waiting politely had buried too many people already. Because coin that sat in a pocket while a child worsened was another form of cruelty. She gave him the smallest acceptable portion of truth. Because he needed it now. The Duke looked down at the packet again. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "Leave these. Go to bed. Master Lewis will wake for another dose in 2 hours. Then sleep in the chair outside his door." She should have curtsied and gone. Instead, she said, "If the eviction riders leave at dawn, families will be put out by noon. The hold notice must go now." "I heard you," he said. "I will send it." Nancy studied his face for mockery and found none. Only a hard stillness that might have been anger, might have been something else she refused to name. She inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." At the threshold she paused, turned back once, and set the pawn ticket beside the packet with deliberate care. "That is the broker's receipt," she said, "for accurate accounting." Then she left him in the study with the ledgers open, the fire nearly out, and rain striking the windows in a patient, relentless rhythm, while upstairs a boy finally slept without fighting for breath. She closed the study door behind her and stood in the corridor with the candle guttering in her hand, listening to the house breathe. Wind pressed rain against the long windows. Somewhere below, a hinge complained and then settled. She expected to hear raised voices from the steward's wing, an argument, denial, the scrape of pride against exposure. Instead, she heard boots crossing the entrance hall at speed and the clipped exchange of men given orders too urgent for discussion. At the far end of the passage, a footman emerged from shadow carrying 2 sealed packets and a stable lantern. He started when he saw her, then bowed. "Miss Johansson, His Grace asks that these go at once." She recognised her own hand on one folded direction. "Hold on tenant removals, pending ducal review." The second carried the apothecary account in fresh ink under the Duke's signet. The footman did not linger. He took the service stair 2 steps at a time. Through the window slit above the landing, she watched the lantern bob across the courtyard toward the stables, then vanish into rain. She had asked for action. It had begun before the wax on her copies was fully cold. Lewis Hale stirred when she returned to his chamber. This fevered child, a different patient entirely from the grown Mr. Hale she had stabilised at Vauxhall. His fever had broken only by degrees, not mercy. His hair clung damply to his temples. His lips were dry. She measured the next dose, slid one arm behind his shoulders, and held the spoon steady while he swallowed in small, reluctant pulls. "It tastes bitter," he muttered. "It tastes like morning," she said. "And I require morning from you." His lashes fluttered. "Are you cross?" "Very." That brought the faintest shape of a smile before sleep dragged him under again. She lowered him carefully, checked the sling, and changed the cloth at his neck. Mrs. Davies came in once with fresh water and once with a folded blanket she set silently over Nancy's shoulders before retreating. Near the 2nd hour after midnight, the housekeeper returned a 3rd time, breath clouding in the cooler draught from the corridor. "The grooms have gone," she said quietly. "One to the village, one to the South Farms with a hold notice. His Grace sent Mr. Crowle to his room under watch." Nancy nodded, too tired for surprise. "And the apothecary. Paid through month's end, in writing." Mrs. Davies hesitated, then added, "His Grace has not left the study." Nancy looked at the sleeping child. "Then he has much to read." "He has had years to read it." The words sat between them, heavy and exact. Mrs. Davies touched Nancy's shoulder once and left. By 4 o'clock, both chamber candles had burned to bent pools of wax, and the rain had thinned to a finer hiss. Nancy rose to stretch her stiff back, walked to the window and rubbed clear a circle of fog with her sleeve. The courtyard stones shone black. A rider passed through the gate at a canter, cloak streaming, then turned toward the Tennant Road without pause. Outcome following order. She had learned not to trust promises. She trusted movement. When she turned back, she saw him in the doorway. The Duke of Marrowin filled the frame without seeming to move. Coat changed, cravat retied, jaw shadowed with fatigue that no valet could smooth away. His eyes went first to Lewis, then to the medicine bottle, then to the folded blanket around Nancy's shoulders, as if inventory were his first language and concern could only travel disguised as assessment. "He woke twice," she whispered, breathing easier after the 2nd draught. He came to the bedside and stood over the boy, hand resting on the bed rail, knuckles whitening once before easing. He did not touch the child, not yet. "Surgeon, due again at dawn." He nodded. Silence held for 3 breaths. "Come," he said. She glanced at Lewis. "I should remain. You will hear if he calls from the next room. Come." The command was low, not harsh, and for that reason harder to resist. She followed him into the adjoining morning room where embers glowed under a banked grate and a tray waited on the table. Bread still warm, broth, tea, and a small covered dish of salted butter. Not servants' remnants. Fresh service. She stopped at the threshold. "Your Grace, this is unnecessary. You are shaking. I am cold. You are hungry." She could not argue the truth without insulting both of them. She sat. Her fingers were clumsy on the spoon. He remained standing by the mantel, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the fire as if watching her eat would violate some older discipline. She finished half the broth before her stomach protested, slowed, then forced herself through another piece of bread because fatigue was a debt with interest. When she set the spoon down, he crossed to the writing table by the window and placed something on the blotter with deliberate care. Silver caught the weak light, her father's watch. Her breath left her in one small sound she did not recognize. She rose so quickly the chair scraped. How? The broker on Mill Lane opens before dawn for men with urgent business. I was his urgent business. She picked up the watch with both hands. The metal was cold from morning air. She opened the lid. JJ inside lightly scratched exactly where she had last seen it. For one unguarded second, her vision blurred. She shut the lid and set the watch down before she could disgrace herself with gratitude she had not consented to feel. "You had no right," she said softly. "No." He did not defend himself. The admission landed more heavily than excuse. "You replaced a transaction I chose. I corrected a failure in my house." She looked up. "Master Lewis is your ward, not your son. The medicine account belonged to your steward. My steward answered to me." The room went still. Rain tapped once at the glass and stopped. He stepped closer, not near enough to touch. Near enough that she could see the fine red line where his collar had chafed his neck raw during the night. "You are covered in bruises," he said. Each word was cut clean. "You have not eaten properly in days. You sold your last family possession to pay for a child who's not yours because my household delayed and my man stole from the sick. You drafted corrective orders while half frozen. You placed those orders in my hand and expected no thanks." Heat rose under her skin. Anger and shame braided too tight to separate. "I expected competence." His mouth shifted, almost a smile and not one. "So do I." She folded her hands to hide their tremor. "Then we are in agreement." He looked at her for a long moment, gaze moving once to the fading mark on her cheek, once to the wrist where Mrs. Blackthorn's grip had left old yellow shadows beneath new ones. He had seen them at Vauxhall. He had seen them tonight. She realized with a jolt that nothing in this room escaped him when he chose to observe. "Do not go back," he said. She held very still. "To London. To that house. It is not your decision. It is now." The force in the sentence struck like a door closing. She felt her spine stiffen. "You cannot command my life because you disapprove of it. I can bar my gates to anyone who comes to collect you." "By what authority?" His answer was immediate. "Mine." There it was. The Duke, entire, rank, will, and a lifetime of obedience from everyone else. Yet beneath it she heard the other thing, rougher, less practiced, not possession, alarm. She met him head on. "If I remain, it is not because I am trapped again under a different roof." Something in his face altered, minute but undeniable. He inclined his head once, accepting the strike. "Then remain by agreement," he said. "Temporary post extended under written terms, wages paid directly to you, no correspondence filtered through Mrs. Blackthorn. If any claim is made on your person or your earnings, it comes to me first." She stared at him. Men like him did not offer terms. They set conditions and called compliance gratitude. You would put that in writing? Yes. Sign? Yes. Today, before noon. Lewis gave a weak cry from the bedchamber. Nancy was already moving. The Duke moved too, faster than she expected, and reached the bedside half a step before her. The boy's eyes were open, wild with fever-dream panic, breath climbing into sharp little gasps. "Do not move me," Lewis pleaded, not yet fully awake. Nancy slid to the other side and laid a hand over his uninjured forearm. "No one will move you." The Duke stood rigid, looking down at the child as if held in place by an old invisible wound. Then, slowly, he lowered himself into the chair nearest the bed. The wood creaked under his weight. He did not speak. He did not reach out. He only stayed, body angled toward the boy, hand on the coverlet, where Lewis could see it when he surfaced again. Nancy measured another spoon of diluted draught and waited for the next swallow. Lewis obeyed this time, eyes fixed not on her, but on the Duke's still hand. "Captain Hale used to sit like that," the boy whispered thickly, "when storms were loud." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I remember." Lewis drifted back into sleep. Dawn lifted slowly behind the curtains, turning the edges of the room from charcoal to pearl. A maid entered once with fresh coals and retreated on silent feet when she saw them both awake. Mrs. Davies came to the door at sunrise, assessed the child and nodded to herself before withdrawing to start the day's machinery. This morning had not yet released them from the night. Time narrowed to breaths, doses, and the scrape of chair legs. Nancy sat in the second chair with the blanket around her shoulders and the redeemed watch in her lap, thumb resting over her father's initials. Fatigue dragged at her like wet wool. Across from her, the Duke did not move, except to glance at Lewis every few minutes, counting, measuring, waiting as if stillness itself were labour he had chosen and would not relinquish. At last her head dipped once, jerked up, dipped again. She fought it, failed, and settled against the chair back with her face turned toward the bed. Sleep took her in uneven pulls. When she woke, full morning light had filled the room. Her neck ached. The blanket had slipped and been replaced more carefully over her knees. Lewis still slept, fever lower, breath steady. The Duke remained in his chair exactly where she had last seen him, coat unbuttoned now, eyes shadowed, posture unchanged. He had not gone to dress for the day. He had not gone to breakfast. He had not gone anywhere. On the side table beside her rested a folded sheet of heavy paper, sealed but unclosed, her name in his hand. She opened it with numb fingers. By order of Alistair Vale, Duke of Marrowind, Miss Nancy Johansson is retained at Marrowind Hall as companion to Master Lewis Hale and interim examiner of household accounts. Wages, 4 guineas weekly, paid each Friday directly into her hand. Residence, East Corridor Chamber. Key held by Miss Johansson. No person is to remove, coerce, or receive her without her written consent. All previous informal claims on her labour are null within Marrowind grounds. Signed and sealed below, bold and final. She read it twice. The crux of her fear had always been the same. Dependence renamed safety. Yet here, in stark ink, he had done the one thing power rarely did. He had limited itself on paper. She looked up. His gaze was already on her. "Stay," he said. Only one word. Command by grammar. Plea by cost. Nancy folded the paper along its crease and set it beside the watch. "I will stay," she answered, voice low in the warmed morning air. "On those terms and no others." He inclined his head once. Agreement, not victory. Then he turned back to the sleeping child and resumed his vigil, unmoving, while sunlight climbed the bedposts and the first clear day in a week opened over Marrowwind Hall. The first clear day in a week had barely settled over Marrowwind when a knock sounded at the open door, and Mrs. Davies stepped in with 2 men behind her, one in steward's black, one in magistrate's brown. Mr. Crowle looked smaller than his ledgers had made him, hat crushed in both hands, eyes fixed on the carpet. The magistrate's clerk held a satchel already tagged with wax. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, bowing once, "we have sealed Mr. Crowle's office. We require formal statements from Miss Johansson regarding the altered accounts and the apothecary delay." Alistair did not rise from Lewis's bedside yet. He looked at Nancy. "Can you stand for it now?" She folded the contract he had given her and set it beside her father's watch. Yes. By noon she had given her statement in the small morning court. Each figure read aloud. Each receipt matched. The pawnbroker's ticket was logged, then returned to her hand. The apothecary's written refusal was copied into record. The rider sent to the South Farms came back, mud-spattered before luncheon, and reported that no family had been removed, all hold notices delivered before dawn. The second rider returned with the apothecary's countersigned ledger, paid through month's end, medicine released in full. Reports sent in darkness had reached daylight intact. When the clerk asked whether she held any further records relevant to Blackthorn debt claims, Nancy felt the old board edge beneath her fingers, as if she were back in the attic cold. "Yes," she said, "a private ledger hidden in my former room. Also, if the library key remains where I last saw it, a dispatch box in the old Johansson library may hold original trust seals." Alistair turned his head sharply, then gave one short instruction. "Take her carriage, 2 constables, recover all items now." Mrs. Blackthorn received them in lavender silk and practised outrage, with Adelaide at her shoulder and Francis at the window pretending boredom poorly. She refused entry. She dismissed Nancy's claim. She denied the existence of any private papers. Then the senior constable read the magistrate's writ in a voice that did not rise once, and the denial broke against the law at last. Nancy went first to the attic. The floorboard lifted where she had always lifted it. The muslin bundle lay exactly where she had left it, dry, corners worn smooth by her own hands. She held it one moment before passing it to the clerk for cataloguing. Then she descended to the library. The key with her father's scratched initials still hung on braided ribbon by the drawing-room side table, as if humiliation had been safer when displayed. Mrs. Blackthorn made a small movement to intercept. Alistair stepped between them without touching either woman. "That key is evidence," he said. Nancy took it herself. In the locked library desk she found the dispatch box beneath old almanacs, and a stack of bills tied with faded blue cord. Inside lay what she had hoped and feared in equal measure: original trust documents, her father's seal impressions, later amendments in different ink, signatures crowded into margins where no honest clerk would place them. She handed each paper to the magistrate's clerk. He numbered them aloud, sealed them, and wrote her name beside every description. As they turned to leave, Gideon Pike entered the hall in clove scent and polished boots, summoned by rumour, too late for control. He looked from constables to sealed satchel to Nancy's face and attempted genial surprise. "Miss Johansson, I had been informed you were considering an advantageous arrangement." Nancy stood in the centre of her father's hall, with mud from Marrowwind still drying at the edge of her hem, and answered without heat. "You were misinformed, Mr. Pike, also audited." His smile thinned. He glanced at Mrs. Blackthorn, and the look he gave her then was the one he had withheld at every dinner table. Not affection, not alliance, only accounting. 3 days later, the creditors' hearing opened in Marrowin's great hall under grey light and full witness. Tenants stood along the side aisles in cleaned work coats, caps twisting in rough hands. Harrow and Pike's clerks sat at the front bench with their ledgers. Mrs. Blackthorne arrived in black satin with rose water, and both daughters in pale silk, as if fabric could argue law. The magistrates entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. Nancy stood at the long table with the sealed evidence laid in ordered rows. Hidden ledger first, dispatch box documents second, apothecary records third, Crowell's reimbursement slips last. She did not look toward the gallery where the titled guests watched. She looked at the page. The first magistrate asked, "Miss Johansson, did you keep this ledger contemporaneously while resident at Blackthorne House?" "I did." "Why conceal it?" "Because open records were altered. Concealed records survived." He inclined his head, made a note, and signalled for the Harrow and Pike examiner. The same gentleman who had once listened in Mrs. Blackthorne's drawing-room adjusted his spectacles, compared seals, compared ink dates, and cleared his throat. Before he began, the clerk read an incident clarification into the record. The man Nancy stabilised at Vauxhall was Mr. Edwin Hale, an adult clerk who survived under surgeon care and bore no relation to Master Lewis Hale, whose separate fever case arose later at Marrowwind. "These trust conversions are irregular," he said. "The debt expansion clauses attached after Mr. Johansson's death lack proper witnessing. Several signatures are non-conforming. I can no longer support enforcement on present terms." A murmur moved through the hall like wind through dry reeds. Adelaide stared at Nancy with bright disbelief, then looked down and never raised her eyes again. Frances gripped her fan until one rib snapped. She said nothing. She never did. Mrs. Blackthorne rose without permission. "This is theatrical malice from an ungrateful girl coached by men who prefer scandal to order." The second magistrate's voice cut cleanly across hers. "Lady Blackthorne, sit." She remained standing. "I managed that house when no one else would." Alistair rose then from the bench reserved for peers, and spoke to the magistrates, not to her. "My stewards have verified Miss Johansson's arithmetic in every tested line. My riders confirmed unlawful eviction notices prepared under mirrored methods. The pattern is established." Mrs. Blackthorne turned toward him, silk rustling like dry leaves. "You would destroy a widow's standing on the testimony of a servant?" His gaze did not shift. "No, on documents. Hers were merely accurate." The ruling took less than an hour after that. Forged expansions voided. Guardianship rights over Nancy revoked. Recovery proceedings initiated against Crowell and associated claimants. Interim protections granted to named tenants. Mrs. Blackthorne was ordered from the hall while the clerk read the final terms. She did not bow. 2 court officers escorted her anyway. Rose water lingered after she was gone, thinner each minute, then gone as well. In the corridor outside, Gideon Pike attempted one last private word with Alistair, and was denied by a single glance. He left by the side door with his hat in his hand, and no one following. That evening, after the hall had emptied and the last tenant had collected a signed copy of stay orders, Nancy stood in the west study where the windows held the early dark. Her hidden ledger lay on the desk, now entered into court record, and returned to her custody. Her father's watch ticked beside it. Alistair came in without ceremony and closed the door behind him. "Mr. Crowell has confessed to diversions," he said. "He named 2 outside brokers. Proceedings continue." "And Mrs. Blackthorne?" "Removed to a smaller property under supervision of creditors. She will not control your earnings or residence again." Nancy touched the edge of her ledger. "Then the figures did what I asked of them." He stood opposite her, hands braced on the desk, shoulders rigid in a way she had come to read as effort rather than anger. "At Vauxhall I told you that you were forgettable." She met his eyes. "You did." "I was wrong. I was cruel first, accurate never." His jaw tightened once. "I offer apology without defence." Silence held, heavy and clean. She had wanted this sentence once, without admitting it. Now that it had come, she found it did not erase anything and did not need to. "I accept the apology," she said, "not the history." "Nor should you." He drew a folded document from his coat and placed it between the watch and the ledger. Marriage articles, already drafted, blank where her terms should stand. "I will not ask as rescue," he said. "I ask as partnership, if you choose it. Name your conditions." Nancy read the page, then lifted her head. "My dowry remains under my sole signature." "Yes." "I oversee the estate school accounts directly." "Yes." "Truth spoken plainly, even when unpleasant." His mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "That term will cost me most. Yes." She took the pen, wrote each condition in her own hand, and signed. Then she slid the page across. He signed beneath, bold and final. They were married at winter's end in the small chapel on the east rise while snow held in the hedges and sunlight broke cold over stone. Mrs. Davies stood in the front pew with Lewis, healed and restless in a new blue coat, his sling gone, his grin irrepressible. The magistrate who had chaired the hearing witnessed the register. So did the old Harrow and Pike examiner, who bowed to Nancy with awkward sincerity before he signed. No blackthorn silk crossed the threshold. Afterward, in the schoolroom she had claimed before she claimed any drawing room, Nancy unlocked a new ledger and entered the first line under her married name and her own. Wages settled, school fund secured, tenant arrears corrected, apothecary account current. She set her father's watch on the sill where afternoon light could find the scratched initials. The hidden ledger from the attic she wrapped in fresh linen and placed in the estate archive. No longer contraband, no longer hidden, only record. At dusk, as bells from the village carried across the frost, and Lewis raced Mrs. Davies down the corridor with both shoes untied and no one scolding fast enough to catch him, Alistair paused in the schoolroom doorway and watched Nancy close the ledger with ink still drying on her fingers. "Does it hurt?" she asked quietly, looking at the old war scar that pulled at his hand when winter was sharp. He held her gaze and answered this time. "Less, when you are in the room." She nodded once, as if accepting an account finally balanced, and blew out the candle.